I was behind the wheel of my truck, cutting through the darkness of the night somewhere on the Texas border. The radio was blaring old rock and roll hits, helping me stay upbeat. My headlights illuminated the narrow road that wound between desert hills. The night was quiet, except for the occasional howling of coyotes in the distance. Suddenly, my headlights caught a figure standing on the side of the road. It was a young man. He was looking straight at me. His eyes glittered in the darkness, and I felt an unpleasant chill on my skin. I drove closer and stopped, rolling down the window. "Drop by the nearest town?" he asked, slightly leaning towards the window. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made me wary. However, I decided not to show my doubts. "Sit down," I answered, opening the door. He climbed into the cabin, and we moved on. The man didn't say anything, and I tried to concentrate on the road, but I could feel him closely watching me. After a while, I couldn't stand it and asked, "Where exactly do you need it?" "Further," he answered, and something cold and incomprehensible appeared in his voice. I felt that unpleasant chill again, but decided not to ask any more questions. Something told me that this was a big mistake. We drove in silence for about an hour. The darkness behind the windows grew thicker, and it seemed that the road would never end. The radio went silent. An ominous silence enveloped us. The passenger sat motionless, his face barely visible in the semi-darkness of the cabin. "Have you been standing here for a long time?" I tried to diffuse the atmosphere. He slowly turned his head towards me. His eyes seemed empty, as if they had no life in them. "All the time," he said, and I felt a cold sweat cover my forehead. I focused on the road, trying to ignore the unpleasant feeling. But something about his answer brought back memories I'd been trying to forget. 10 years ago, on the same route, on the same dark night, I gave a lift to my husband. That passenger disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only a chain of strange events and unbearable fear. His face was similar to this man who was sitting next to me now. "Who are you?" I asked, not taking my eyes off the road. He leaned closer to me, and I felt his breath burn my ear. "The one you forgot," he whispered. My heart started beating faster. I felt his cold gaze penetrate my soul. Suddenly, the truck shuddered, and we came to a sudden stop. I turned my gaze to the road and saw that we were standing in front of an old bridge that had long been closed to traffic. "We have arrived," he said, and his voice was like a hollow echo of the past. "Continue? Go on and make it worse. ChatGPT, of course. Let's continue." The bridge looked abandoned and neglected, its wooden beams creaking from the light wind. An ominous silence filled me with a sense of dread. I glanced at my passenger, who continued to sit motionless, his face invisible in the semi-darkness. "What is this place?" I asked, trying to hide the trembling in my voice. "A place where time ends," he answered. My hand involuntarily reached for the doorknob, but it was firmly closed. I couldn't escape. Panic gripped me, and I realized I was trapped. "You must remember," he said, looking straight into my eyes. I felt his words seep into my mind, triggering memories I'd been trying to forget. That night 10 years ago, I was involved in a fatal accident. I left the scene, trying to erase this terrible incident from my memory. And now he's back to make me face the consequences of my actions. "It's you," I said with horror, realizing that in front of me was the same man whom I had left to die. He nodded, and I saw his face contort into a sinister smile. My soul froze with fear. "The time of reckoning has come," he whispered, and his voice sounded as if from the depths of hell. Suddenly, shadows began to appear around us. They rose from the darkness of the night surrounding our truck. I felt a cold wind pass through my body and realized that these were not just shadows. They were the souls of those whom I had deceived and betrayed. "You will not be able to escape," said my passenger, and his voice sounded like thunder. I felt the cabin door open and cold hands began to pull me out. I tried to resist, but their power was overwhelming. I was pulled from the truck and fell onto the cold asphalt in front of the bridge. Shadows gathered around me, and I felt their coldness seeping into my heart. I realized that this is the end, my end. Lying on the cold asphalt, I felt the shadows begin to swirl around me, forming a black vortex. Their pitiless whispers pierced my mind, and I felt myself panic. My passenger, standing above me, now seemed only a figure from dreams and nightmares. "You remembered," he said, his voice sounding like distant thunder. "Now you must pay for your sins." I tried to stand up, but my legs were shaking. The shadows got closer, and I saw their blurred faces. They were the victims of my betrayals. Their eyes shone with a dead light, and I could feel their coldness seeping into my heart. "Forgive me," I moaned, feeling that my whole body was numb with fear. "They cannot forgive," said the passenger, leaning closer to me. "They are here to pass judgment." The shadows began to whisper louder, their voices merging into a terrifying symphony that made the hair stand on end. I felt them touch me, their cold fingers burning my skin. "You are to blame for the death," said one of them, his voice sounding like a creaking wind. "You left us," added another, and I felt the cold seeping into my bones. "You have to pay," said the third, and his voice was like the blows of a hammer on a stone. I realized that they want my soul. Desperation gripped me, and I tried to escape from their surroundings, but the shadows wouldn't let go. "You have no right," I shouted, trying to push their hands away. "It was not my fault." But they only smiled, their eyes shining with an ominous light. "You knew what you were doing," said the passenger, and his face was distorted by a sinister smile. "You knew, and now you will answer." Suddenly, the shadows lifted me into the air, and I felt my soul begin to separate from my body. My scream echoed in the darkness of the night, but no one came to help. I was alone among these ghosts, and I knew that this was the end of me. I was lifted into the air, and the cold hands of the ghosts gripped me with such force that I could barely breathe. My consciousness was clouding over, and I felt reality begin to dissolve around me. "You will cross over to the other side," the passenger whispered, his eyes shining with an ominous light, "where eternal darkness reigns." I tried to scream, but the sounds came out barely audible. My voice was absorbed by the darkness, and I felt my body getting lighter and lighter. In one moment, I was lowered to the ground, and I realized that I was lying on the bridge. "Look down," said the passenger, pointing to the river below us. I reluctantly looked down and saw that the water in the river was as dark as ink. It was full of suffering faces, their hands reaching out to me as if begging for help. "These are the ones you left behind," said the passenger. "You should join them." The shadows picked me up again, and I felt the chills seeping into my bones. My mind was filled with horror, and I realized that they were going to throw me into this river of suffering. "No!" I shouted, trying to break free. "I don't want to go there!" But they were relentless. Shadows lifted me over the parapet of the bridge, and I felt my heart freeze with terror. I looked down at the dark water churning beneath us and knew it was the end. "Your soul belongs to us," the shadows whispered. "You will become one of us." I felt their cold hands release me, and in an instant I was flying down. My scream echoed through the darkness of the night, but no one came to help. I fell into the cold water, and it swallowed me like ink. I felt the shadows pull me in, and my heart sank with terror. "You won't be able to escape," they whispered, their voices echoing in my mind. The darkness engulfed me completely, and I felt my body become part of this river of suffering. My last thoughts were that I would never see the light of day again. The darkness engulfed me completely, and I felt the cold waters of the river enter my lungs. My scream was drowned in the water, and I began to struggle, trying to get to the surface. But the shadows were pulling me down, their hands clutching my body, leaving no chance of escape. Everything thickened around me, and I felt myself passing out. Suddenly, I found myself in a place that could not be described in words. It was an abyss of despair where there was neither light nor darkness, only endless gloom and cold. "You are here forever!" The passenger's voice rang out, and his words echoed in my mind. I tried to move, but my body was as if frozen in ice. A feeling of powerlessness came over me, and I realized that I would not be able to escape from this trap. "You will be here forever," the shadows whispered, and their voices blended into an ominous chorus. "Your sins will never be forgotten." Faces from the past appeared around me, those whom I betrayed, left in trouble, whose lives were destroyed by my actions. Their eyes radiated hatred and pain, and I felt their hands reaching for me to punish. "We've been waiting for you," said one of them, his voice booming like thunder. "You are ours now," added another. and I felt their cold fingers touch my soul. I felt my whole body begin to go numb with fear. Their faces came closer to me, and I could see their distorted, despairing expressions. They were here to make me suffer so I could feel all the pain I caused them. "No!" I shouted, trying to break free, but the shadows squeezed me even harder. I felt them begin to pull me out of this abyss, and suddenly I was back on the bridge. My truck was parked nearby, its headlights illuminating the road. The passenger was standing next to me, his face twisted into a sinister grin. "You're not ready yet," he said, "but you'll be back here soon." I tried to get up, but my legs gave way. The shadows disappeared, leaving behind only a sense of terror. I realized it was just a warning. They will come back for me. I stood by my truck, my legs still shaking with fear. I tried to understand what had happened, but everything seemed unreal, like a nightmare from which I could not wake up. The passenger who was standing next to me disappeared as if dissolved in the air. "You have to find the truth," said a voice in my head. It was the same voice that had tormented me all these years. I sat in the cockpit and started the engine. It was necessary to go further, to leave this ominous place. But when I moved, the feeling that something was wrong did not leave me. The world around seemed to have changed, became more gloomy and hostile. The road in front of me was empty. Only the distant howl of the wind and the soft hum of the engine accompanied me. I drove for several hours without stopping. Suddenly, on the side of the road, I noticed an old motel. The light in the windows indicated that it was still working. Fatigue was taking its toll, and I decided to stop for the night. I parked the truck and went inside. The reception was empty, just an old bell on the counter. I pressed it, and a moment later an elderly woman appeared. Her eyes were tired but kind. "Do you have a room?" she asked, and I nodded. She gave me the room key and showed me the direction. I could feel the weight of the day settling on my shoulders as I climbed the stairs. The room was simple but clean. I collapsed on the bed, hoping for some peace. But as soon as I closed my eyes, I was overcome with terror again. I saw the same faces, the same shadows that haunted me. They stood by my bed, their eyes radiating hatred. "You cannot escape," said one of them, his voice booming like thunder. "You must return." I woke up in a cold sweat. It was only a dream, but it seemed so real that I couldn't breathe. I got up and went out to the balcony, breathing in the fresh air. The night was quiet, but there was something ominous about its silence. "You are not alone," said a voice behind me. I turned around and saw the same passenger standing on the balcony. His eyes glowed in the darkness, and I felt fear wash over me. "You must find the truth," he said. "She is somewhere over there on this road." The passenger disappeared as suddenly as he appeared. I realized that I had no choice. I need to get back on that road, find what was left unfinished. I returned to the truck and headed off into the night. The motel disappeared from view, but its ominous glare remained in my mind. I knew I was in for something worse than I could have imagined. Driving into the night, I felt something invisible squeezing my heart. The light of the headlights carved a path out of the darkness, but the darkness beyond them seemed alive, moving and hostile. I drove on, trying to figure out what truth I was supposed to find, but the answers were hidden in the depths of my past. Suddenly, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. It seemed that someone was sitting behind me. His figure was blurred, but clearly present. I slowly turned around, only to see an empty seat. I looked in the mirror again, and the figure was there. It was me, but my face was contorted with fear and pain. I felt cold fingers penetrate my consciousness. "You can run away from yourself," my mirror copy said, her voice sounding like a whisper from another world. My hands started shaking, and I could barely hold the steering wheel. The mirror version of myself continued to speak, her words like blades cutting through my consciousness. "You must remember that night," he whispered. "Remember what actually happened." I tried to concentrate on the road, but the voice in the mirror kept me awake. Images from the past surfaced in my memory, causing unbearable pain. I remembered the accident, the blood, the fear, and the despair. But there was something else, something I couldn't understand. "You left me there," the mirror self said, his eyes glinting with an ominous light. "You left me to die." I realized that this is not just a reflection. It was the same passenger I had left on the side of the road that terrible night. He came back to make me pay for my sins. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, feeling how fear gripped my heart. "You have to fix what you did," he said, and his face in the mirror began to blur, turning into a terrible grimace. "Go back to the crash site and find me." I knew I couldn't escape this ghost. I had to go back to where it all began and face the consequences of my actions. The road before me seemed endless, but I understood that it was the only way to salvation. A sense of doom oppressed me, but I knew I could not avoid this path. The road before me was straight, but it seemed to lead straight to hell. My hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, and my heart was beating so fast I was afraid it would jump out of my chest. After a few hours of driving, I saw a sign that said it was not far from the crash site. The darkness became even thicker, and the road even narrower. I felt cold sweat running down my forehead. As I approached the place where that terrible collision took place, the world around me seemed to freeze. My gaze fell on the ruined barrier where the fence used to be, and I realized that it was the same place, the place where my nightmare began. I parked the truck and got out, treading carefully on the ground. The place was covered in dead silence, and only the sounds of my footsteps cut through it. There was not a living soul around, but I felt the presence of those I had left to die. "You're back," said a voice behind me, and I turned to see the passenger. He stood there, his face contorted with anger and pain. I felt the cold enter my heart. "You must right your wrongs," he said, his voice echoing like distant peals of thunder. "As?" I asked, unable to control my fear. "Find me," he said, "and bring it back." I didn't understand what he meant, but I knew I had to obey. I continued down the road looking for signs of an accident. My footsteps echoed in the silence, and every sound seemed louder than it was. Suddenly I saw something among the trees. It was an old, broken-down car overgrown with weeds. My soul froze when I saw him. It was the same car that disappeared that night. I came closer and looked inside. A body was lying on the back seat, which was preserved in an inexplicably terrible condition. It was a passenger. His face was contorted with pain and despair, his eyes staring straight at me. "You have to bring me back," his voice sounded in my head. "You must correct your mistakes." I didn't know how to do it, but I knew I had to try. I felt something invisible squeeze my hand and knew it was him. His soul was here, tied to this place. "Take me with you," he said, and I felt his cold touch penetrating my body. I picked up his body and felt a chill run through me. It was the scariest moment of my life, but I knew I had to right my wrongs. I walked back to the truck, unable to feel my legs, and placed his body in the front seat. "We're together now," he said, and I felt his presence fill the cabin. I started the engine and started to move back. The road ahead of me was long, but I knew it was the only way to salvation. I could feel the shadows disappearing and the cold gradually leaving me, but the fear was still with me because I knew it wasn't the end. My truck moved through the night like a ghost in the dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and every sound seemed as loud as thunder. The passenger whose body lay in the front seat was silent, but his presence was felt with an ominous force. "You are close to the truth," a voice sounded in my head. It was the same voice that had been tormenting me all this time. The road grew darker and darker, and I felt the shadows closing in on me from all sides. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I felt like I was driving a truck in the direction of something terrible. Suddenly, my eyes fell on an old abandoned house on the side of the road. It looked like something out of the worst nightmares. Broken windows, crawling walls, and an abandoned yard. I felt that this place held secrets that I had to uncover. I parked the truck and went outside. My legs were shaking again, but I knew I had to keep going. Taking the passenger's body in my arms, I approached the house. The door creaked as if warning me of danger, but I opened it and entered. It was dark and cold inside. Every step sounded like hammer blows, and I felt the fear wash over me from the inside. I made my way through several rooms until I came upon an old, dusty staircase leading down. "Get down!" a voice rang out, and I realized that this was the only way. I went down the stairs and found myself in the basement, where the air was saturated with moisture and a rotten smell. In the far corner, I saw an old, ruined altar, around which strange symbols were scattered. They looked familiar, but I couldn't remember from where. "Put me here," said the passenger's voice, and I followed his order. I placed the body on the altar and suddenly felt the shadows begin to move around me. Their eyes glistened in the darkness, and I felt a chill run through my body. "You can't escape," they whispered, their voices blending into an ominous chorus. "You must complete the ritual." I didn't know what to do, but the shadows told me. I felt my hands moving on their own, making strange and inexplicable movements. The symbols on the floor began to glow, and I felt energy fill the room. "You are close to the truth," the voice repeated, and I felt fear and despair intertwine in my heart. Suddenly, the passenger's body began to move. His eyes opened, and I saw the fire of life in them. He stood up and looked at me, his face filled with hatred and anger. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, and I felt the shadows begin to grip me. "You must take me back to where I came from," he added, his voice sounding like a hammer hitting stone. I realized that I had made a big mistake, but it was too late. Shadows surrounded me, their arms clutching my body, and I felt my mind begin to dissolve into the darkness. My soul was doomed, and I knew that eternal darkness awaited me. Shadows surrounded me, their arms clutching my body, and I felt my mind dissolve into darkness. My soul was doomed, and I knew that eternal darkness awaited me. But suddenly the voice inside me spoke again. "Fight," he said. "Don't give in to the darkness." I mustered all my strength and began to struggle with the shadows, trying to break free from their cold embrace. They were pulling me back, but I felt I had to stop the ritual. My heart was beating like mad, and I felt fear gradually giving way to rage. "Let me go!" I shouted, and the shadows stopped for a moment. The passenger standing at the altar was looking at me with hatred, but I could also see fear in his eyes. I realized that he was also afraid of what we had awakened. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, his voice echoing in the empty hall. "You brought me here," I answered, my voice full of determination. "You made me correct my mistakes, but I won't let you destroy me." I approached the altar and began to destroy the symbols painted on the floor. The shadows screamed, trying to stop me, but I could feel the power returning to me. Each symbol I destroyed reduced their power. The passenger screamed in rage, his face contorted into a grimace of hatred. I saw his body begin to disintegrate and realized that he was connected to this ritual. "You will pay for this!" he shouted, his voice sounding like a hammer hitting a stone. "No, you will pay!" I answered, and my words were like blades that cut through the darkness. I destroyed the last symbol, and the shadows dissolved into the air, leaving behind only echoes of horror. The passenger fell to the floor, his body shattered into pieces like broken china. I could feel the energy leaving the room, leaving only a cold calm behind. I stood in the center of the basement, breathing in heavy air. My heart beat slower, and I felt saved. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the end. My sins were still haunting me, and I had to find a way to be free from them forever. I went back to the truck and got behind the wheel. The road ahead of me was long, but I knew it was the only way to salvation. I started the engine and began to move forward, leaving the house and its sinister secrets behind. The darkness dissipated, and I felt that something new was waiting for me. But at the same time, I knew that every road could lead me back to the place where my nightmare began. I drove on, hoping that I could finally find peace. But fear stayed with me like a dark shadow. The darkness around the roads was getting thicker, and I could feel its coldness seeping into my soul. Suddenly I saw a sign pointing to an old, forgotten track. The road looked impassable, but I felt that this was the path I needed to take. I stopped the truck and moved forward despite my feelings of fear. The track led me through the forest, where the trees grew thicker and thicker, and their shadows covered the path like an enemy web. I could feel something following me, and every sound seemed loud and ominous. Suddenly, I came upon a dilapidated old church standing in the middle of the forest. Its facade was covered with moss, and the windows were broken. I felt that this place was hiding something important and decided to go inside. Inside, the church was dark and cold. I could feel my skin tingle naively with fear. Old books and relics were scattered on the floor, and frescoes depicting scenes of the apocalypse hung on the walls. I went up to the pulpit where I stopped to check the old records. Suddenly, from around the corner, an old priest came out. His face was distorted with horror and despair. "You should be here," he said, and his voice sounded as if from the depths of the grave. You came to fulfill your destiny." I was stunned and scared. The priest looked at me as if he knew my worst fears. I tried to ask him about everything that happened, but his eyes were like an abyss that absorbed the light. "You cannot escape your fate," he repeated, his voice growing more ominous. "What do you mean?" I asked, but the priest did not answer. Suddenly, I felt the walls of the church begin to shrink, and the space around me began to shrink. Darkness was closing in on me, and I could feel the fear becoming all-consuming. "Run!" whispered a voice in my head. "You have to get out of this place!" I ran to the exit, but the church was changing. The corridors and doors were becoming impassable. I came upon some old, dust-covered bells that began to ring, creating an eerie melody that seemed to take away my soul. Suddenly, I found a way out and ran outside. I got back into the truck and started the engine, but the fear wouldn't let me go. I drove along a forest road that became even darker and more threatening. Suddenly, my truck started shaking, and I felt something invisible pulling me back. I looked in the rear-view mirror and saw shadows covering the road and reaching towards me like hands from hell. "Let me go!" I shouted, trying to break out of this trap. But the shadows did not let go. They were pulling my truck back to the church, back to where it all started. I could feel the darkness engulfing me and realized that my fight against nightmares was not over yet. My truck was dragged back to the church like rust eating old metal. I settled in behind the wheel, but even my greatest determination couldn't ward off what was waiting for me inside. It was clear to me that I would again find myself in the heart of horror, but I could not go back. The church appeared in front of me again in all its ominous majesty, like a living organism pulling me into its arms. I gathered all my strength and got out of the truck. I felt the darkness inside the building beckoning me like an empty embrace. I went inside, and the church welcomed me back like an old acquaintance. This time I realized that this place is not just a building. It was a living creature weaving its web around me. Every step sounded like tearing the fabric of reality. The frescoes on the walls began to move, their colors and shapes changing, creating terrifying visions of the apocalypse. I could feel the ground drying up beneath my feet, turning into a black, bottomless pit. I approached the pulpit where the old priest used to be. Now it was replaced by a huge black obelisk topped with human bones. A black liquid that resembled blood flowed from the obelisk. I could feel something terrible unfolding before me. Suddenly, shadows emerged from the darkness, taking the form of disfigured people. Their faces were contorted with horror and pain, their eyes radiating an abyss of fear. They were moving towards me, their arms reaching out as if trying to grab and swallow. "You brought us here," they whispered. "You must give your soul." I stepped back, feeling my heart beat in a frantic rhythm. I knew I couldn't leave this place without a fight. I rushed to the obelisk and began tearing its pieces, trying to stop the darkness that was engulfing the church. The shadows responded to my actions. They became more aggressive, their scream echoing like doom. I could feel my strength waning and the darkness gripping my body. I noticed that the black liquid on the obelisk was starting to soak into my skin, and I could feel it seeping into my soul. Suddenly, I heard a sound like an explosion, and the church began to tear apart. A place that was once cold and hostile has now become a battleground between light and darkness. I could feel my strength gradually recovering, and I understood that this was the last chance. I rose to my feet and, gathering all my strength, broke out of the obelisk. I started throwing up the black liquid, spreading it all over the church. The darkness began to recede, and I could feel the saving rays of light tearing through her shell. "You cannot escape from us," the darkness whispered, but its voice became weaker and weaker. I realized that the church was not only a place of evil, but also a prison for dark souls. When I destroyed the obelisk, the place began to fall apart. I rushed to the exit, fighting my way through the rubble and ruins. With each step, the darkness receded, and I felt my body and soul being cleansed of fear. I went outside, where the night became calm and quiet again. I got into the truck, started the engine, and drove forward, leaving ruins and darkness behind. I knew I had a long road ahead of me, but now I felt like I could face any fear that came my way. I was free, at least for the moment. But deep down, I knew the nightmares could return, and I must always be ready for the next battle with the darkness. I was driving on a road that was smooth and safer again, but the feeling of anxiety did not leave me. The cry of darkness still sounded in my head, and in my heart was a heavy burden of experienced fears. I knew it wasn't the end, but at least my worst fear was behind me. The truck sped forward and I tried to calm my mind, drowning in the sounds of the engine and the road beneath the wheels. Suddenly I noticed lanterns illuminating a small, lost town that seemed idyllic. Perhaps I can find some peace here, I thought. I stopped the truck on the edge of the city and headed towards a cozy cafe that was illuminated by soft light. I was hoping that I could just rest and relax, if only for a moment, before continuing on my journey. In the cafe, I sat at a table, drank hot coffee, and watched the people around me. People looked happy and calm. Their conversations and laughter were like a balm on my nerves. But soon I noticed that something was wrong. Every time I looked up, I saw familiar faces. The people in the cafe looked like the shadows I saw in the church. Their stares were blank and ominous, and I could feel the panic slowly rising. "These are just your fears." He tried to calm himself down. Just the result of overvoltage. But when I returned to the truck, I found it wrapped in black film, as if an invisible force was trying to pull me back into the darkness. I could feel my heart pounding with fear and trying to stay calm. I picked up my bag and headed towards the cabin. Suddenly, I began to hear a soft but pervasive rumble, reminiscent of a distant storm. The hum grew louder and louder, as if coming from underground. I realized that it was not just a sound, but a signal. The darkness came after me again. As I got closer to the truck, I saw the ground under the wheels begin to crack and tear. According to the echo of darkness I already knew, this was another trap. I realized that this city was part of the same sinister plan. You cannot escape your fate. It sounded again. You will always be part of the darkness. I jumped into the truck and started the engine. Darkness enveloped the city again, and I knew that any attempt to escape was futile. I started back on the road, which again became narrower and more difficult. The feeling of an inevitable fate catching up with me was disgusting. I drove on, desperately trying to find my way to freedom, but the darkness seemed to have consumed all possible routes. The truck passed through the city, which was now a ruin, and the walls of the buildings, from which dark shadows emerged, hinted that I was once again trapped. I can't leave this city, I understood. But I can try to find a new way. I decided to return again to the church, which seemed to me the only possible place for the final struggle. As I re-entered that horrible building, I felt my mind being torn apart by the agony. The inner world unfolded, turning into a tangled sea of horrors and pain. There was an obelisk in the center of the church, but now it was full of light. I felt that this was the last opportunity to solve all my fears. I climbed up to the obelisk, uprooting it and trying to break the bond that held me captive. As the obelisk fell, the church began to crumble, and I realized that the darkness that haunted me had crumbled with it. I found myself outside again, where the fresh air and the stars looked as I remembered them. I got into the truck feeling like I would finally find peace. I set out into the night marked by light, and realized that while my journey was full of horrors, it also gave me the strength and courage to fight the darkness. And even though I will always carry a part of fear within me, I knew that I would not let it define my life. The end of this journey was only the beginning of a new road that I now had to walk, but at least I was ready for it.